Hi, welcome to the fourth session of History 3375, CIA in the Third World. Over the last couple of weeks, we've been putting together the various pieces we need for the course, and we're going to finish that up today. We've looked at the emergence of the Third World and Third World nationalism, looked at U.S. foreign affairs, and beginning last time, we started to look at the evolution of U.S. intelligence operations and intelligence institutions, with a particular focus on the CIA. Now, a couple of the themes that I was stressing last time have to do with, one, the cyclical nature of U.S. intelligence activity down through the 19th and up until the middle of the 20th century. And that is that during times of warfare, there'd be intensified activities, and then when peacetime came, those activities would cease if institutions had been created, and they were created very slowly, as we saw. They tended to be reduced in size because any imminent threat had largely disappeared. And we saw that only gradually were institutions of intelligence like the Army Signal Corps, Army and Navy intelligence created over the course of the latter half of the 19th and beginning of the 20th century. The other thing that we looked at was a sort of counter-cyclical process that, beginning at the end of the 19th century, the U.S. was developing a covert action capability. And we saw examples of this from the Philippines to Mexico to Nicaragua. And we also saw, as we get into the 20th century, an increasing capacity for dealing with codes and code breaking, cryptography. So these are the processes that are shaping U.S. intelligence activity down until the Second World War. And it's only at the time of the Second World War that we begin to get a long-term investment in intelligence institutions and intelligence activities. Partly because of the war itself, we saw the creation of the OSS, saw the Office of Strategic Services, and then with the end of the war, the emergence of the United States as the leading world power, and the sense that some type of ongoing intelligence activity was going to be necessary, and fairly enhanced intelligence institutions would be necessary even after the dismantling of the OSS after the war in 1945. And that leads to the creation in 1947, of course, of the Central Intelligence Agency. And what we looked at in the agency's early history were, again, a couple of phenomena. One was that the agency was really designed to be a centralizer, a collector of intelligence data from various sources, both within the U.S. and outside, and to offer to the President, through the National Security Council, a coherent picture of what was going on in the world. That's what it was intended to do. And to some extent, it would always do some of that, right down to today. The head of the CIA, the Director of Central Intelligence, provides a briefing on a weekly basis to the President, sometimes more frequently, depending on what the world situation is. And yet, that has not proved to be the main function through much of its history. Through much of its history, as we know, and as part of the course itself, the agency has focused on covert operations, particularly political and paramilitary operations intended to overthrow various governments, or in a rare case, such as Vietnam, intended to prevent the toppling of a particular government. So that has become the main focus, and one of the things we've been trying to look at, or have begun looking at, is, well, why did that happen? Why the shift in emphasis? We saw in part because of the emergence of the Cold War in Europe and the Cold War across the globe in Asia. We saw bureaucratic infighting, which was in part the FBI and others don't want the agency fulfilling its main task, which is the gathering and analysis of data, because they're already doing some of that. Military intelligence is the same way. And they don't want to give that information to a DCI and see it subsumed under his control. At the same time, many of these agencies are more than willing to shuttle off onto the CIA the responsibility of carrying out covert operations, such as the ones that were conducted in Eastern Europe and on the borders of the People's Republic of China after 1945 and after 1950. So this is where the CIA gets involved in covert operations. And of course, some of this is also dictated by the membership of the CIA itself that most of its officers early on come from the OSS, come from the Office of Strategic Services, and therefore are quite well versed in covert operations. This is the kind of thing that essentially comes naturally to them. We also saw the reorganization of the CIA, giving it a more coherent and what became its permanent institutional form as a result of the Korean War. As a result of what were felt to be intelligence failures, the failure to predict the coming of the North Korean invasion, the failure to know what was happening in South Korea once the invasion got underway, led to the appointment of a new director of Central Intelligence, Walter Bedell Smith, and he gives the agency essentially its permanent institutional structure with the various deputy directorates, one for plans or covert operations, one for intelligence, and then administration. And that's where he had brought the agency's development up until this point. Now, another factor that influences the agency and continues to push it in the direction of covert operations is the character of some of its directors, their experience, their background, their inclination. And no one is more significant in this regard than the next man to take over the CIA after Bedell Smith in 1952. And here, if we go to the first slide, you'll see Allen Dulles. Allen Dulles would serve as the Director of Central Intelligence from 1952 to 1961. He was considered the sort of American master spy. Allen Dulles essentially creates the mold for directors of Central Intelligence. We'll see a number of them who fit the pattern of Allen Dulles. In fact, they look like they all copied each other's resumes because they're so similar. One, he's a graduate of Yale University, so he comes from the Eastern establishment of privilege. And two, he had experience in the OSS. In fact, he was the head of the efforts by the OSS to spy on Nazi Germany and made efforts to topple Hitler during the course of World War II. And in that role, serving in Switzerland, he became known as this classic cloak and dagger figure, somebody who was capable of great feats of intelligence gathering and carrying out secret operations. It was something that he would carry forward into his activities as the Director of Central Intelligence. So he comes with both that Yale background and pedigree, but also this experience in the OSS. Now, during his time as Director of Central Intelligence, the CIA, experiences what can be considered the beginning of its golden era. Things go well for the CIA during much of his tenure, from 1952 to 1961, and generally things went well through the 50s and the 60s for the CIA. It seemed to be an agency capable of extraordinary feats in terms of intervention and carrying out the surreptitious goals of American foreign policy. It was considered a real can-do agency under Allen Dulles. Now, part of this has to do with the relative freedom that Dulles had to operate. Congressional oversight over the CIA in these years is next to nil. There are times when the CIA, the Director of Central Intelligence, will report to various congressional committees, the Armed Services Committee, etc., about what some of the things are that the CIA is doing. But in reality, there is no close supervision of the agency from Congress. In fact, as I pointed out last time, the agency's budget is actually secret. It's hidden away in various parts of the federal budget, and only a few members of Congress are actually sure where those pieces are and how much the total budget is. So there is relative freedom of action on the part of the CIA when it comes to Congress at this point. It has very few, if any, formal reporting obligations to Congress, and it has a budget which it pretty much manages on its own, and that is dictated by what the executive considers to be sufficient funds for the activities of the agency. If we go back to the slide again, we'll also see another important factor that influenced the agency at this time, and that is the principle of plausible deniability. This is a principle that will be exercised by many U.S. presidents in the second half of the 20th century. And what it amounts to is simply this, that the agency is a group within the federal government that a president can go to and say, I want you to do something, and it's important, and although this is unspoken, we both know it's as illegal as hell. But I need to get it done for national security reasons. So I want you to do that. Okay, I'm going to suggest to you in indirect terms that you go assassinate this political leader. And it's illegal under U.S. law. But I want you to do it. It's important. Now, if you blow it, or if you succeed but then you're exposed, I, as president, will say, I don't know what those clowns were thinking. I didn't tell them to go kill anybody. I told them that they had to deal with Leader X, that something had to be done about him. They are the ones that took the bit between their teeth and ran off and killed this person or tried to kill him. If an operation goes terribly awry, I'll say, look, I didn't authorize this kind of thing. I told them that they needed to confront these problems that were occurring in this country. I didn't tell them to go topple that government. And at various times, as we will see in history, presidents have been in a situation where it would be extremely embarrassing for them to admit that they had ordered a particular action on the part of the CIA. But generally, not always, but generally speaking, the answer has been to say, I gave an order, but the order was not what was carried out. Okay? They've gone beyond the limit. So it's plausibly deniable, because this is a covert operations agency. I didn't know everything that was going on myself. Over time, an image also emerges of the agency as this sort of rogue agency that goes off on its own and does things. That grows out of the practice of plausible deniability, of presidents saying, well, I didn't intend them to go do this, when in fact, and we will see this in several cases, when the president says something in a National Security Council meeting and the Director of Central Intelligence is there, even though the language may be indirect and abstract, the Director of Central Intelligence knows what the president is saying. Case in point will be Eisenhower. Now, Dwight Eisenhower was president during the time that Allen Dulles is Director of Central Intelligence. His Secretary of State is John Foster Dulles, Allen's brother. The three of them are rather close. The three of them essentially shape U.S. foreign policy over the course of 8 years. So when Eisenhower, in a meeting of the National Security Council, said that the leader of the Congo was somebody that they were going to have to deal with, that he was going to have to be dealt with, the Director of Central Intelligence, it wasn't like he was talking to the man on the moon. These people got together all the time. Allen Dulles knew what Eisenhower was telling him. He wanted him to go kill that guy, and they would make that attempt, as we will see. So this makes the agency extremely appealing to executives. And presidents down through the years are always happy with the CIA, at least privately. Publicly, they may be damning it whenever it gets caught doing something. But privately, they know this is an agency they can go to. They can do things that are illegal. They can do things that they cannot justify to the public, etc. All of that can be done through the CIA. So this, again, enhances the power of the agency through much of its history, because it always has that appeal. Whether it's a Democratic or Republican president, doesn't make any difference. It has that appeal. You can go do things that you don't want to explain to the public. You can do things that are illegal, and if they get caught at it, that's their problem. They get stuck with the problem, not you. So this further enhances the power of the agency at this time. Now, one other thing, if we go back to the slide for a second, under Dulles, in particular, under Allen Dulles, during his term as Director of Central Intelligence, there is essentially a wall that is built between covert operations and intelligence activities within the agency. That there are these two deputy directorates of intelligence and plans, or operations as later known, covert operations and intelligence. But Dulles insists that they operate almost independently of each other. Now, you would think that if you're going to plan a covert operation, you'd want to turn to the intelligence people to have them tell you what are conditions in a country, what do we need to know before we go in and do this. But Dulles actually separated those two functions. So covert operations operated largely independently of the intelligence function. And when asked why, he would explain that, well, he didn't want the covert operations people pressuring the intelligence people to give them answers that they wanted. In other words, I don't want those guys over in covert operations making our intelligence analysts uncomfortable and pressuring them to say things that will justify an intervention and so forth. But that wasn't why Dulles did this. In fact, it was quite the opposite. What he didn't want was the people in the analysis side, the intelligence side, to discourage the covert operations side, because he loved covert operations and he didn't think much of intelligence. Given his experience over the years, he felt he knew far more than any, wet behind the ears analyst what was going on in the world. And he didn't need them telling his covert operations people what to do. As we will see, this will work for a while, but in the end, in 1961, it will be the downfall of Dulles because of the extreme separation and because of the disparaging attitude that he had towards the intelligence side of the agency. Sometimes you really do need those people over in analysis to tell you what's going on, otherwise you get yourself in big trouble. Dulles will learn. Now, during the agency's years of the 1950s in particular, it took on a variety of issues in terms of intelligence activity and covert operations. One of the things that it became involved in is what one author called the search for the Manchurian Candidate. The Manchurian Candidate is actually the title of a movie that describes a group of American soldiers during the Korean War who were captured by the Chinese communists. Several of them are brainwashed, but one in particular is brainwashed so that when he returns to the United States and is given a particular code word, it will trigger him to go out and assassinate a political candidate in the United States. Frank Sinatra, Lawrence Harvey, if you really want to find it at your video store. It's a very good movie. But what it reflects is a mentality in the U.S. that emerged during the Korean War. During the Korean War, military leaders in particular, but political leaders as well, were shocked by the fact that captured American troops were being filmed by the North Koreans and the Chinese, making statements that were thoroughly anti-American, denouncing their own country as an imperialist power, saying that they were there to attack the Korean people and the Chinese people and to destroy their revolutions, etc., etc. So both the military and the political leadership were appalled at seeing what was happening. The analysis of this, the conclusion was that these men were victims of brainwashing, that literally their will, their ability to think independently, their values had largely been destroyed by whatever processes the communists had used, generally termed brainwashing. So a real concern develops about, gee, can we do that? If they can do it, we better be able to do it. And this has wonderful possibilities, because as the movie The Manchurian Candidate displays, although it was made a decade later. But it raises this idea that, boy, we could have robots, people who are robots. We want to assassinate somebody. We just brainwash this person and we send him out, and he's not going to worry about staying alive, surviving the assassination. He's just going to go up as close as he can and shoot the person, and it doesn't bother him that he's going to be shot because he's been brainwashed. So the CIA began a search for chemicals, procedures that would allow them to do precisely that, to take over the psyche, the mind of an individual, and use that person in any manner that they chose. Now, the fact is, as we now know, closer analysis, brainwashing really wasn't quite what it appeared to be. These people who had made these statements and confessed to war crimes and denounced their own country were suffering from various forms of torture involving sensory deprivation. And this doesn't mean, pounding somebody's head in, because that doesn't work. First of all, you look bruised, and two, you get pounded too often and, you can't even talk straight. This was more subtle. For example, keeping someone awake for several days in a row. If you've ever tried this with friends or something, after maybe 48, 72 hours, most people start to get psychotic. They start to lose it if they haven't been able to get any sleep. Well, if you do this to a person who's, a prisoner of war, far from home, totally isolated, and then for the next 5-7 days, he's in this chamber with these bright lights on, there's martial music blaring. Anytime that he does fall asleep, somebody comes in and whacks him on the feet to keep him awake. After a few days, he's gone bonkers. He'll do whatever you want. There's also a psychological element here that we see with captives in hostage situations and terrorist situations that you often can begin to identify with your captors, because they're your only hope for survival. If you can't please them, you become childlike. If you can't please them, you're dead. So whatever they want you to do, you're going to do. You become committed to these people, not because you have any identification with their ideology or whatever it is they're after. It's just that your survival now depends upon the whim of this individual. So you're willing to do whatever it will take to please that person. It was these kinds of psychological forces that were at work with the U.S. soldiers who were captured. And of course, most of this would dissipate once they were freed from that situation. So these weren't techniques that you could take and do to somebody and then send them out into the world to assassinate people or serve as a spy. As soon as they got away from it, they might suffer some permanent psychological damage, but they were not going to be the kind of obedient servant that appeared on those films. Nevertheless, the CIA at this time did believe that there were chemicals, techniques that could create a Manchurian Candidate. So they began experimenting, and if we go back to the slide here, one experiment involved a group of civilian army employees who were told that they were to go on a retreat. They were going to go to a cabin outside of the Capitol and spend the weekend talking about their jobs and what they could do to improve their work, etc. One of these kinds of things that have become actually quite common in corporate and government circles over the decades, that you get together in a relatively informal atmosphere and discuss your job, your careers, how you can do better in your work. That's what they thought. In fact, it was an experiment involving the use of LSD that was being conducted by the head of the Science and Technology Division of the CIA, a man named Sidney Gottlieb. Now, Sidney was of Eastern European origin. He had received his PhD from Columbia, and he was a rather unusual soul. He walked with a limp, but he was a fan of polka music. So he used to come into the CIA office on a regular basis and demonstrate new polkas to his colleagues, dancing with his limp, and with a very heavy odor of goat cheese on him, because he apparently spent most of his life eating goat cheese as his main dietary intake. Sidney was one of the people who provided a prototype for Dr. Strangelove. And he's in charge of science and technology. And Sidney has decided that he's going to experiment with these human beings. And one of them, a man named Olson, had suffered from suicidal tendencies in the past. He had serious problems with depression. When he ingests the LSD, it immediately triggers a severe psychological reaction. And once again, he becomes intensely suicidal, hallucinatory. CIA has to bundle him off. They want to send him to a psychiatric hospital in New York. So he's put on a plane with a CIA officer. They stop overnight in Manhattan at a hotel. And during the night, while his keeper is asleep, Olson gets up, opens the window, and leaps to his death. As a result of this, and by the way, his family was not told at the time what actually happened. It was just a tragic accident. Gottlieb's punishment was to get a letter of reprimand in his file, saying, don't do that again. It was sort of indicative of the agency that, on the one hand, it had all this freedom, but it also meant there were no constraints upon it. There was no one overseeing this and saying, well, you can't do that to innocent human beings. These are American citizens. You can't just do what you want to them. But there was not that kind of restraint. And there was, on the other hand, this sense of urgency and need that we were in this Cold War. So almost anything could be justified. Another area where they attempted to improve their intelligence and covert capabilities was in the area of technology. And if we go back to the slide again, one of the people that played a central role here was the chief assistant to Allen Dulles, Richard Bissell. Richard Bissell, another Yale man, another OSS officer, considered a brilliant, brilliant person. And he would take much of the responsibility the oversight for these efforts to improve certain technologies. One of them was a question of listening technologies. One of the problems with spying on people through listening devices is that listening devices generally don't distinguish between sounds. If you're taping this class here today with a little tape recorder, that tape recorder will pick up somebody rustling a piece of paper just as loudly as it may pick up my voice. So when you're listening to it, you're saying, God, I can barely hear it. It sounded so clear in class, but listening to it on the tape, it sounds like there's an anvil chorus going on in the classroom, because the tape recorder can't focus in on my voice. If nearby sounds are loud, it's going to pick them up, and that's going to cover up the sound of my voice. So the problem with listening devices oftentimes was a lack of acuity, a lack of focus. So one of the things that the CIA came up with was the idea of using cats as listening devices, because cats have fairly acute hearing, and they have directional hearing. You'll notice when a cat is listening, its ears are almost like two radars that they'll flick here or there, listening for the sound, for the direction of the sound. So if you could get a cat and use it as a listening device, the cat would actually be directional. It would give you a more acute hearing sense. So what they did was they inserted an electronic probe in the brain of a cat and also an electronic transmitter from its hearing nerves, and took it out into Washington to experiment with the idea that they'd have a little control box, like a radio control car, that they could shock the cat's brain so the cat would move in certain directions, a bit jerkily, of course, when the electric shock hit it. But the idea was they could guide the cat to a particular area. The cat would sit down and listen to a conversation. Unfortunately, the first time they put the cat out, they had him walking across the street, but they weren't tuned into his acute hearing, which heard a van coming, which ran over the cat, splat. End of experiment. So they had to give that one up. So much for the $6 million cat. On the other hand, they did make a major breakthrough in technology with the creation of the U-2 spy plane. One of the difficulties that the CIA had run into, and what becomes a classic problem in intelligence in the modern age, is the issue of human agents and their ability to penetrate and operate in modern state systems. You're hearing a lot right now, because of the problem with weapons of mass destruction, that we don't have enough human agents in places where we need intelligence information. Well, one reason why the CIA came to depend so much on technology, and this dates back to this time in the 50s, is simply this, that very often, as we've seen in the case of their operations in Poland, but very often in going up against a modern state system with its own fairly efficient security system, these agents could be readily detected and eliminated. And they were, not only in Poland, but in Eastern Europe in general, in the Soviet Union, People's Republic of China. It's not easy to do this. First of all, it's almost impossible to take somebody from outside the country and then insert them into a situation where they can gather effective intelligence. And how many people can possibly learn a second language and speak it without the hint of an accent? Tiny percentage. And on top of that, you got to create a history for this person. Where have you been for the last 20 years? Where are your identity documents? And so forth and so on. It's very difficult to do that. And even when you do have people operating who are nationals and spying for you on their own government, they're relatively easy to detect. Oftentimes, what you find when spies are successful, it's because the agencies around them are so oblivious to the threat that they haven't really made a serious effort to find the spies. So, more often than not, human spies were being identified and often eliminated or turned into double agents. So during the 50s, the CIA is looking for technologies that will help compensate for the fact that human agents often can't operate for very long or very effectively under the scrutiny of modern security systems. And this led to the creation of the U-2 spy plane, which again, Bissell was responsible for. Yeah, we'll see that again at the bottom of the slide, that the U-2 spy plane was a creation in part of Bissell and private corporations. The Lockheed Corporation designed the plane. Polaroid provided the cameras. And the basic idea of this plane was that it would fly at extremely high altitudes, so high that the Soviet anti-aircraft and Soviet missiles would be unable to bring it down. And it would take pictures of key locations in the Soviet Union and provide enormous amounts of intelligence data. Do they have nuclear capacity? How many nuclear plants do they have? How big are they? Their industrial plants, their size of their military bases, on and on and on. Huge amounts of intelligence data could be gathered as a result of the use of this plane. And it, from design to the production of the first model, took only 18 months because Bissell had total control. He didn't have to answer to any government bureaucrats except himself, Dulles. He had the contingency fund to spend millions of dollars doing this. He didn't have to get prior approval for those expenditures, so he could move very rapidly and create this plane. And it's one step in the direction of using technology to replace or at least supplement human agents because, as the CIA is learning, very difficult, at least when you have highly centralized governments with modern intelligence services of their own, very difficult to penetrate them with human agents. Now, all of this is occurring in a domestic environment which is becoming intensely anti-communist, anti-left. After World War II, there was a good... Let's turn to that slide, the next one. After World War II, there was intense instability in the U.S. labor movement. Let's go back to that slide, okay? We can. There was intense instability in the U.S. labor movement at this time after the war. Workers had made a lot of sacrifices during the war, many of them gone off to the war itself. Inflation was causing serious problems, and workers were increasingly militant in their demands for what they wanted. And they wanted more than just wages and better hours. They wanted more say in how their jobs were run, etc. As a result, there is a strong movement in the country to denounce these labor movements as communistic. And a link is quickly developed between the communist threat represented by Joseph Stalin and the Soviet Union and what is seen as communist influence within the unions in the United States. So it becomes both a domestic and an international campaign. And of course, the person who comes to symbolize this whole era is Senator Joe McCarthy. McCarthy, a senator from Wisconsin, claimed that communists had penetrated not only labor unions, but the film industry and, most importantly, various elements of the U.S. government. He waved a list and claimed that he had the name of several hundred communist agents operating within the U.S. government. Well, in fact, he didn't. There was nothing on the list. But the fact is, there was an intense fear. Yes, there were communists trying to penetrate the government, but this became almost at the level of paranoia, a belief that communist agents were everywhere, hiding under the bed, and that the United States was in imminent danger of being conquered by the Soviet Union, and that in that process, domestic communists would play a critical role. In fact, films were made by the U.S. military, by the U.S. government, in which you see scenes, where suddenly there is an uprising by communists. They take over small-town USA. They create a communist state in the United States. And much of this is carried out not just by the Soviet Union, but by domestic communists operating as a fifth column to undermine the U.S. government. With those kinds of views, the U.S. was launched on an intense anti-communist campaign. In fact, John Foster Dulles, the U.S. Secretary of State during these years, brother of Allen Dulles, described it as a crusade. That for him, this was a crusade of Christianity against godless communism. And that mentality was reflected in many people who helped guide American foreign policy in these years, that this wasn't just a contest over who will have influence in a certain part of the world, but that the fate of humanity itself was at stake, much as it had been during World War II, only this war was being fought on different terms in economic struggle and through covert operations, etc. That set of conditions gave vent to what I describe here in the last part of the slide as the Cold War consensus. There was a general feeling throughout the country, in Congress, that the executive branch of the government was involved in this desperate crusade against communism. And the executive had to be given as much free rein as possible, the president, his advisors, to carry out this war against communism. This was not a time for internal domestic debate over is this the best thing to do, etc. If the president says, look, we're doing this because we have to fight communism here or over there, there really wasn't going to be a great deal of questioning of that decision in Congress or in the general public. So presidents in the 50s and the 60s in particular had enormous leeway. If they identified a foreign policy problem, and more often than not they did, as a threat of communism, the American public and the Congress were almost certainly to support an aggressive policy in dealing with that issue, and they really were not going to ask a lot of questions about how the problem was dealt with. There were not going to be questions at this time about covert operations. Gee, that government got overthrown that we didn't like. Did we have anything to do with that? What was the CIA doing exactly? There really was not a lot to question. Military budgets got approved with relative ease, so did the covert budget of the CIA. Anything that was needed for this struggle was seen as something that Congress and the American people had to give if we were going to win this particular war. Now, because of that, as we see in the next slide, the focus of much of what the U.S. was doing early on in the late 40s and certainly in the 50s and even beyond was focused on the Soviet Union, whether it's military issues, intelligence issues, etc. Most of this focuses on the Soviet Union because they're at the core of this. I mean, this is the first communist country created in the world, the first communist society. This has been a threat, or perceived as a threat, as we saw earlier in the course, ever since the time of Woodrow Wilson. And now it's come down to the U.S. versus the Soviet Union. So Moscow is really the prime target. And in the process, West Berlin becomes the prime outpost for the Central Intelligence Agency. West Berlin becomes spy central in the world. There were probably more spies per capita in West Berlin in the 1950s than any place else in the world ever. Because there were U.S. spies, there were French spies, there were British spies, there were German spies, there were East German spies, there were Soviet spies and Czech spies and Polish spies, etc., etc., etc. And they all came there to spy on each other. It was seen as our listening post on the East and their listening post on the West. So we spent a lot of time digging tunnels, trying to get into their intelligence information. They spent time digging tunnels under our places, trying to get our intelligence information. West Berlin was the largest CIA station in the world. And that means everything but Langley, Virginia, the headquarters. At the same time, despite this intense effort, there are some problems. This is an agency which, under Allen Dulles, as we've seen, is committed to human spies. Getting people to spy for us who are already in the Soviet Union, putting people in the Soviet Union, Eastern Europe, People's Republic of China, who will spy for us, etc. As much as, we're experimenting with some other areas like LSD and so forth, and we've got the U-2 spy plane, we're starting to work with that. Nevertheless, the primary focus was still on human agency. And that, as we've seen, was becoming increasingly problematic, because whether it was the Soviets or the Chinese or the Czechs, etc., they proved to be just about as good as we are at catching people who are spying on them, including their own citizens. At the same time, the agency still had this problem of defining its role. There are still bureaucratic fights Military intelligence doesn't want to share information with the CIA any more than they wanted to share it with Bill Donovan and the OSS in an earlier time. The same with the Defense Intelligence Agency, which is an intelligence agency, operates out of the Defense Department. The State Department has intelligence activities. But none of them want to share. None of them want to do what they're supposed to do, which is give information to the Director of Central Intelligence. So as a result of the obvious limits of Cold War spying, that humans, yeah, we feel they're important and they're essential to what we're doing, but often they get caught. Often we don't know if they're working for us or the other side. And the fact that the CIA really doesn't ever assume that role of controlling intelligence input from other federal agencies. This is an agency in search of a mission. In the sense, yeah, we know what we're supposed to be doing, but we really can't do that. And at the same time, and that is gathering information and coordinating it. And at the same time, our efforts to carry out intelligence work and covert operations through human agents, more often than not, aren't very successful, at least when we target places like the Soviet Union. And this, despite the fact that we have as our leader, our DCI, that master spy, Alan Dulles. So what to do? What to do? And we have this capacity to spy, to carry out covert operations. We want to use humans, but oftentimes in places like the Soviet Union, not very effective. We've got some technological capability, but that's not really what Alan Dulles is all about. You know, as much as, yeah, we need the U-2 spy plane, it's not what gets his blood, you know, flowing in the morning. And it's increasingly difficult to get Alan's blood flowing in the morning. He's getting a bit old. But nevertheless, this is what he wants to do. He wants human spies. He loves hopping around from station to station, visiting and looking in on covert operations and what we're doing to spy on the Ruskies and everybody else. But still, this is not the most effective use of human resources. If we go to the next slide, we'll see that this convergence of factors helps lead the agency towards third world countries. On the one hand, this is an emerging area of great importance to the United States. As decolonization occurs, as the European powers surrender their control over various parts of the world, in Africa, in the Middle East, and in Asia, new societies are developing. And we've seen that these societies have built-in resentments towards the West. They also have a certain admiration for how the Soviet Union has developed in the past half-century. And we're concerned that they will choose this third way, neither capitalism or communism according to them, but as far as we're concerned, choosing the third way means you're against us. So can we influence what's going to happen in these countries, particularly countries that prove resistant to our influence through foreign policy, through foreign aid, etc.? Besides the importance of this area in the struggle in the Cold War, there is the fact that these are newly created states. Most of them in the 1950s are no more than a couple of years old, even in the 1960s. Most third world countries have only been in existence for a few years because more and more of them are coming into existence in the 50s, 60s, and into the 70s. So these are societies that have barely had an opportunity to structure a state system, much less modernize it and create effective security apparatus. So these are countries where human agents still can be highly effective because in most cases, not all, but in most cases, their ability to prevent foreign penetration or to prevent spying and other activities by their own citizens is not very great. So there is a real opportunity here to use human agents, just what Alan Dulles wants to do, far more so than in the prime target, the Soviet Union. That convergence of both what the U.S. is concerned about, where is the third world going, and an opportunity for the agency to continue its covert operations activities and be able to use human agents in a more successful manner than in targets like the Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China, helps give an increased focus to the third world. And in the 1950s, In 1953 and 1954, the CIA scores two major successes. These are the first two cases we're going to be looking at in the next couple of weeks. In intervention in Iran, to topple the regime there, restore the Shah of Iran to power, and in Guatemala, to overthrow the government there of Jacobo Arbenz and put in a military officer who we consider to be much more pro-American. So here in two operations in the Third World, one right after the other in 53 and 54, the agency confirms that can-do reputation. Now, most Americans are totally unaware of what the CIA specifically did, or that it did anything in Iran and Guatemala. But people in the know in the government, they know that the agency did these things, and the agency enhances its reputation. These are guys can go in and give them an order, in 6 months they overthrow a government, just like that. It's almost like they're magicians. We'll see, of course, there's a lot more to it than what appears to be on the surface. But nevertheless, the agency appears to be this group of miracle workers who can remove one government and replace it with another in the matter of a few months. So this gets the ball rolling, and we will see the agency become intensely involved in third world countries through the rest of the 50s, 60s, 70s, and beyond. Now, of course, things didn't always work out in the agency's favor. Specifically, in 1961, the CIA plans the overthrow of the government of Fidel Castro in Cuba. And seemingly using a blueprint borrowed from Narcisco Lopez from the 1850s, we talked about U.S. foreign policy, decides that it will arm about 1,200 Cuban exiles, land them on a beach in Cuba, and that action will stimulate a rebellion against the Castro regime and lead to his overthrow. CIA is supremely confident about all of this. When one of the planners is asked what they have in mind, he says, oh, it's the Guatemalan scenario. In other words, it's going to be another easy toppling of a Latin American government. Instead, the invaders are pinned on the beach. The CIA is exposed for its part in this whole operation, which was planning and carrying out the whole operation. And President Kennedy, who had only been in office for 4 months at the time, is left with this disaster on his hands. As we will see, for very good political reasons, he does not choose to engage in plausible deniability, but instead goes to the American public and says, yes, I did it. Very good reasons why I tried to do this. So I know you're unhappy that it failed, but the fact is we had good reason to do it. Not unlike more recent president who said, well, we may have been wrong for the reason we went to war, but we're right anyways. Kennedy was using a slightly different version. We may have failed, in our CIA operation, but we did it for the right reason. However, as much as Kennedy got on television and said, it was the right reason we tried to get rid of communism and bring freedom to the Cuban people, he wasn't saying that in private. He had some very, choice words about Allen Dulles and Richard Bissell. Bissell had been the principal architect of the Bay of Pigs operation, and of course Allen Dulles, as director of Central Intelligence and the #1 fan of covert operations in the world, had convinced Kennedy to pick up on what was a plan already initiated by the Eisenhower administration and carry it through. Kennedy's response, if we go back to the screen here, is to choose a friend of his, General Maxwell Taylor, to establish a commission to investigate what went wrong. And this will become a common pattern. Just as we've just had another commission established, we've had a whole bunch of commissions and committees created over the years. Every time there's a major disaster involving the CIA, the answer is, okay, let's form a committee and investigate, and we'll get it straightened out. They never straighten it out. But in any case, the Taylor Commission came back, and they did say that, in polite terms, that the primary responsibility was on management in the CIA, that the manager of the CIA, read Allen Dulles, was too hands-on in his dealings with covert operations, that you needed somebody who had a more balanced approach to the agency's operations and a more objective approach in dealing with covert operations. Now, the message to Allen Dulles and Richard Bissell was, on the one hand, they were given medals for distinguished service to the American people, and Kennedy personally hung those medals on them. On the other hand, it was made known to them that, look, if this were Germany, we just leave a Luger on your desk, you go in and do the right thing, you shoot yourself. Instead, since it's Washington and not Berlin, they went in and signed letters of resignation saying, it was best for everybody that they go now. They had other career opportunities they wanted to explore. Kennedy wanted both of them, he wanted them out, and they were going to go. But on the other hand, you put on a good face and give them a medal and let them sign a letter of resignation. But this marked one of the low points in the agency's history, that after these stunning successes and after earning this reputation as this can-do agency, we can overthrow a government like that, suddenly we had this catastrophe where this very large operation had been mounted in the Western Hemisphere. It was impossible to deny that it was the CIA, and it had been a catastrophic failure. And we will go in much more into the details of why it failed and so forth when we talk about that specific intervention. But in the meantime, it had a resounding effect in Washington in terms of tarnishing the agency's reputation. Did not destroy it by any means. As we will see throughout the 1960s and into the 70s, the agency still had a lot of pull, a lot of influence, was still looked upon as an important part of U.S. foreign policy. But nevertheless, this is the first major damaging incident. And when these occur, as I said, one thing that always happens is they always establish a commission or committee to investigate and report back with findings, which then everybody basically ignores, for the most part. That's the way the government works. And secondly, what they always do, and they will do again in the contemporary situation, is you get rid of the Director of Central Intelligence. A head has to roll. Somebody has to pay the price. And certainly the president is not going to go put a Luger on his own desk, nor is he going to resign because of one of these things. Kennedy might have been willing to, throw off plausible deniability and admit to the public, almost because he had to, that the CIA was involved and he was involved in this. But on the other hand, he certainly wasn't going to take the major blame for it. Other people would have to. Now, one recommendation of the Taylor Commission that is implemented is to find a new director, obviously, but in particular the focus was to an outsider. And this is another classic, you'll see this repeated in the history of the CIA time and again. Scandal, investigation, new director, outside. Get somebody from the outside. Clean things up. No more OSS people, no more Yale graduates. We need an outsider, somebody who can bring a fresh approach. We'll do this time and time again. And this time, it becomes this man on the next slide, a man named John McCone. McCone's an outsider. Was never in the OSS, never had any real dealings with the CIA. He'd been a defense contractor during World War II and made his fortune on the West Coast as a defense contractor. Since then, he'd served as Secretary of the Air Force, so he was certainly familiar with military issues, defense issues, and he was currently serving as the chairman of the Atomic Energy Commission. The Atomic Energy Commission at that time was responsible essentially for all nuclear programs in the United States. So he's had some fairly substantial administrative responsibilities in both the private and public sector, and he certainly is familiar with many issues involving defense and foreign affairs. And he was chosen because he fit the kind of mold that the Taylor Commission had suggested. He was a manager. He didn't have any particular axe to grind. He was not a big person emphasizing the intelligence side or the covert operations side. He was an outsider and hopefully an objective individual. Now, during his time as Director of Central Intelligence from 61 to 65, one of the things that the agency does is develop the Discover program. This was a step into the future. recognizing that the U-2 spy plane couldn't last forever. In fact, the U-2 spy plane already had problems. In the closing years of the Eisenhower administration, a U-2 spy plane piloted by a man named Francis Gary Powers had been shot down over the Soviet Union. And Gary Powers, deciding that life was the better part of valor, decided not to use his suicide pill that he was given, that all U-2 spy plane pilots were given, to kill himself. You know, kill yourself, don't reveal any secrets. You kidding me? He put it away, and they put him on trial and so forth, and he was finally returned to the United States, and later became a traffic reporter out in L.A. A lot safer, well, I think, than flying a U-2 spy plane, but it was a major international incident. But most of all, it revealed that the Soviets were getting better at shooting stuff down out of the sky, and the U-2 spy plane would not be practical forever, particularly for spying on the Soviet Union. So they had to find new ways. The Discover program was the first spy satellite program. The idea was that these satellites would be shot up into space with cameras to record the same kinds of information that the U-2 spy plane had collected. Now, the American public, as far as it knows, is looking at a weather satellite program. Now, the reason why the public was even told was that at this time it's not possible to take pictures from outer space and transmit them directly back to Earth, not with any degree of clarity. So what you have to do is you have to take the pictures and recover the film. So what would happen after the spy satellite had flown over the Soviet Union, taken its pictures, it would eject a capsule that would come hurtling back to Earth, and a parachute would open over the Pacific, supposedly, and a huge cargo plane would be flying over the Pacific trailing a net, so that somewhere out there in the middle of the Pacific, and millions of square miles of the Pacific, this little capsule, which is about that big, would come floating down, and these guys had to maneuver this plane and pick it up with a net. Needless to say, it didn't always work. In fact, one time the thing landed just outside the Soviet Union. They're not sure really what happened to that one. But it was a major operation. I mean, it was not something they could easily hide because of both the launches and because of the fact that they had to go collect these things with these huge planes. So they told everybody it was weather satellites, and people were satisfied with that. We didn't know that the government didn't tell you the truth at that time. But in any case, the program is launched and does mark a major step forward in technology. The problem is that this program helped reignite the issue of the Director of Central Intelligence and whether, in fact, he had total control over intelligence in the U.S. Because to get the satellites up in space, you have to turn to the Air Force. They got the rockets that'll shoot them up. And the Air Force at this time is very concerned about its position for the future. These guys are all, you know, the people that really make it up into the ranks, former fighter pilots, etc. They believe in piloted aircraft. And yet, more and more, we're building intercontinental ballistic missiles, satellites, and you don't need people. I mean, the Mercury space program, for example, you know, these guys are being put into a can, basically, and shot into space and come back. But they're not piloting the thing. You know, they're just like a monkey being shot into space and brought back on the end of a parachute. So the Air Force is concerned about, you know, where's the Air Force of the future going to be? So one of the things they want to get control over is the spy satellite program. So they have a fight with McCone and the CIA because the Air Force wants these cameras to be high resolution. They want to be able to see every detail so that they can tell exactly how many planes the Soviets have on a particular airbase. Whereas the CIA is concerned with bigger issues. All we want to know is, okay, there's an airbase over here, and we can count, the number of planes. We don't know whether they're M16s or M15s. It doesn't make any difference. We just know they get that many. We want the general picture. In the end, McCone has to compromise and put on both kinds of cameras in the Discover program. And as you'll see here on the slide, this also leads to the creation of the Office of Satellite reconnaissance, which means really it is an office that the CIA has to share with other intelligence agencies that gathers and analyzes the satellite data. So even though the CIA was the initiator, in the end it winds up having to share this information. The importance of this is simply that although Kennedy said he wanted McCone to be a true director of Central Intelligence, that Allen Dulles was too busy running covert operations, playing spy guy, I want you to do what we intended to do with DCI to begin with. But Kennedy never gave him the backing. So in the end, McCone couldn't do it, even though he tried, any more than Dulles didn't do it because he didn't care. So still, even as we hit the mid-1960s, even as we approach the 20th anniversary of the creation of the CIA, the DCI still doesn't do what he was intended to do. He still doesn't have this overall command of intelligence data in the United States. Now, despite the failure of the Bay of Pigs, this was not the end of covert operations for the CIA. It became heavily involved with efforts to counter guerrilla warfare in Latin America. Che Guevara, who's listed here, was a close ally of Fidel Castro. He believed that they could spread revolution throughout much of the Third World. After fighting in Africa for a time, he goes to Bolivia in an effort to create a revolution there. The CIA helps track him down, and eventually he is assassinated by the Bolivian military. So the CIA becomes very involved in counterinsurgency efforts, not only there, but increasingly so in Vietnam. As we will see, the CIA's involvement with Vietnam actually goes back to the OSS. The CIA had long been involved in Vietnam, but it intensifies that involvement in the 1960s as it tries to salvage the government of South Vietnam and tries to fight the communist insurgency that threatens it. So the CIA hasn't backed off covert operations by any stretch of the imagination. It's just that they are making efforts in the other direction as well in terms of the gathering of intelligence information and using new technologies to overcome the limits of human intelligence and now the need to replace the technology of the U-2 spy plane with more advanced technologies, namely spy satellites. And all of this takes place under McCone. But what is particularly memorable about his time is that in the end, he still couldn't be the DCI that the agency was designed to have. Now, if we go to the next slide, we'll also see that this period, by the mid-1960s, becomes another period of controversy for the agency. And this is a time when scandal starts to erupt. Before, with the Bay of Pigs, that was an operation that went bad and caused problems. People were critical. This is more of an area of exposés being done on the agency and causing public embarrassment. Ramparts magazine was a magazine that was a muckraking magazine that liked to expose government scandals, and it did a piece on the CIA and did precisely that. One of the things that it revealed was that an organization known as the National Students Organization was being funded by the CIA. The National Students Organization was meant to provide a forum for student leaders from universities around the country. Now, the CIA, for years, had been organizing such groups in third world countries and in Europe and elsewhere. But it decided if it works so well there in countering communism, why don't we try it here in the U.S.? We'll set up this national organization, we'll help fund it, and we'll help promote the training of student leaders who are anti-communist. Of course, that's a violation of the law. CIA is not allowed to do those kinds of things that would and could influence domestic events, domestic politics in the United States. Another revelation was that the publisher, Prager Press, and most of you, if you've ever taken a social science course, probably bought a book from Prager Press because they, at least for many years, dominated the field in things like sociology and political science, etc. Well, it turns out Prager Press had published several books that were subsidized by the CIA. Again, this is a no-no, because we don't want a covert agency influencing what we read. We don't want them putting out a certain viewpoint to us as if it's an objective, impartial viewpoint coming from some university professor, when in fact it's something that the CIA wants to put out to the public without telling them that it's the CIA. With this scandal, President Johnson established another commission. This one was the Katzenbach Commission. Nicholas Katzenbach had been the Attorney General under President Kennedy. Let's go back to that slide for a minute, just because even I can't spell Katzenbach. Nicholas Katzenbach, therefore, had a reputation for law enforcement, and he's put in charge of this commission. The commission concludes that the agency must stop doing these things, which of course it has to anyways, and that the agency was probably overextending itself, doing too many things, involved in too many operations, and increasing its risk. Another thing that happens as a result of these scandals is that greater oversight is created. There's a more formalized oversight in Congress now, specifically the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and the House International Relations Committee. They're both the same, it's just one's in the Senate, one's in the House of Representatives, now have a formal oversight role, with the Director of Central Intelligence reporting to them. But even now, and we're talking in the 1960s, these committees do not have a right to preempt or prevent any operation by the CIA, nor is the Director of Central Intelligence obligated to tell them in advance of any specific operation. He doesn't have to go to them and say, well, you know, by the way, guys, we're going to overthrow the government in country X in about 6 months, just so you'll know. He doesn't have to tell them that. He has to give them a general idea, well, we're trying to counter communist influence in Africa and over here, etc. We are carrying out intensified intelligence of this part of the world, but they're not going to get that kind of specific information. And most importantly, even if they get an idea that something serious is going on, they don't have a right to preempt it. They cannot prevent them from carrying out a particular operation. Now, after John McCone's term, we go back to the good old boys. Richard Helms becomes Director of Central Intelligence in 1966. Richard Helms was a graduate of Yale University and former officer in the OSS. He'd come up through the ranks of the CIA. He had been Deputy Director of Plans, in other words, in charge of covert operations, before he stepped into the DCI chair. So he's a classic model. You know, he and Allen Dulles look like they were cut from the same cookie cutter. He has a somewhat difficult time, however, because he serves much of his term under Richard Nixon as president and Henry Kissinger, who serves first as Nixon's national security advisor, in other words, the guy that runs the National Security Council, and then later as Nixon's Secretary of State. Because when Nixon comes in, Nixon says, look, the State Department, yeah. CIA, yeah. A couple of bureaucracies, they're full of these old Eastern establishment people, they don't know what they're doing. I want direct control over intelligence and over foreign affairs. He sets up back-channel communications with U.S. ambassadors. In other words, they use secret military communications channels to communicate with U.S. ambassadors in places like South Korea. This was never done. There's a strict chain of command in the government, including in the State Department. When North Korea invaded South Korea, the U.S. ambassador in South Korea did not call the White House. He contacted the Secretary of State, who contacted the White House. You go through the chain of command, but not for Nixon. He wanted direct control. And with the CIA, he also felt the CIA was a lot of baloney. He really wasn't interested in having Helms give him weekly briefings. He usually ignored much of what Helms was telling him. Instead, if we go back to the slide here, we'll see that Kissinger, as a national security advisor, uses the staff of the National Security Council. And the staff means these are usually young military officers, people trained at Ivy League schools in foreign policy and public policy. He uses the staff of the National Security Council to carry out some of the functions of the CIA. For example, they're trying to figure out how effective their bombing in South Vietnam or North Vietnam is. Well, in both. Much of that analysis of aerial photography was done by the staff of the National Security Council, bypassing the CIA. So there's going to be a centralization in that regard. Furthermore, besides these problems of dealing with Nixon, who really doesn't have much respect for the CIA, there are problems mounting in Vietnam as the U.S. commitment there grows. It has become, since 1965, a place where hundreds of thousands of U.S. troops have been committed and where the CIA has continued expanding its role. Out of this has come a major controversy called the uncounted enemy. And we'll get into this when we talk in detail about Vietnam, but at this time the basic issue is this. Are we talking about 1 million communists that we're fighting over there? Or maybe 300,000 or 400,000? The military says, well, it's a smaller number, somewhere down around that way. CIA says, no, it's the bigger number. If it's the bigger number, we're never going to win in Vietnam. We're never going to be able to eliminate enough of these people. If we're talking millions, maybe, it's just too big. We'll never be able to deal with it. So a fundamental controversy between the CIA and the military erupts during this period as well. We'll see the outcome. And finally, that last point on that slide, the CIA is still into covert operations. In 1973, it assists in the overthrow of President Salvador Allende of Chile, who dies during the coup that topples him from power. And the CIA becomes deeply involved. As we will also see, 2 Americans were murdered by the Chilean military, and there was strong suspicion at the time that the CIA was involved in those murders. So things aren't going all that hot for the agency at this point. When Helms steps down, in part because of controversy, and if we go back to the slide, we'll see that his successor is another cookie-cutter director of Central Intelligence. William Colby becomes director in 1973 and serves to 76. William Colby, Yale graduate, OSS officer, headed the CIA station in Saigon, South Vietnam, director of the Deputy Directorate of Plans or Operations, Covert Operations. Now he's Director of Central Intelligence. It's Colby that has to face a new onslaught of investigation, this time coming from the U.S. Senate. The committee headed by Senator Frank Church is investigating. And it discovers, among other things, that the CIA has been opening people's mail, along with the FBI. We're talking about here in America. They discover that indeed the CIA was involved in that coup in Chile. They discover that the CIA, on a number of occasions, has plotted to assassinate people. They discover that the CIA assassinated more than 20,000 people in South Vietnam. People are unhappy. They're outraged. Now, how can you be doing all these things? They're illegal. Out of these hearings and the general uproar, as we'll see here, as we look at the latter part of that slide, comes the creation of the Select Committee on Intelligence, a permanent congressional committee with more direct oversight over the agency. Still can't stop them from doing something, but now we have a committee that focuses specifically on intelligence issues and especially on the CIA. There is also now a requirement that before any significant operation can be undertaken by the CIA, the president must sign off on a national intelligence finding. This is supposedly to get rid of plausible deniability. That I can't just say to the Director of Central Intelligence, you know, that guy's really an annoyance. You need to do something about him. And he goes out and tries to assassinate that guy. Now I have to sign a document, supposedly, that says, go kill him. Unfortunately, what really happens is the president signs a document that says, the country of Z continues to be a national security threat to the United States, and I authorized the CIA to undertake covert operations to deal with that threat. What does that mean? I mean, kill somebody, drop a bomb on somebody? Who knows? One final problem for Colby, besides the investigation and so forth, was James Jesus Angleton. James Angleton was Kim Philby's friend, the man who had helped establish the CIA with him in 1947. Angleton never recovered from discovering that Philby was KGB agent. And now in his dotage, he was tearing up the CIA, searching for spies, moles, KGB agents within his own ranks. And Colby had to get rid of Angleton because he was tearing the agency apart from inside. There was so much suspicion and doubt among people within the agency about each other because of what Angleton was doing, he had to be forced into retirement. And as we will see, his actions have an enormous effect because they basically freeze further attempts to find spies within the agency. And the agency will pay a major price in the years ahead for not looking more closely at its own people and the potential for spies. But the witch hunt of Angleton discourages all of that and leads to future problems. When we come back, we'll look at the agency in the late 70s, 80s, right down to the present time.